I have a question for you this morning. Do you like history? Do you like reading it, watching it, say in a documentary or historical drama? You know the best thing about history? You always know the end of the story, right? You know the Nazis don't win World War II. You know the war to free the slaves does free the slaves. You know the end of the story. But what if you're not reading history? What if you are experiencing history? Yeah, that's a big difference. Do you know the difference? When you're experiencing history, you don't know the end of the story. Like, right now in Ukraine, a lot of people are fighting for the win, but they don't know if they will win. And that's scary. You know, with all these historic heat waves we've been experiencing, we hope that we figure out how not to burn up our planet. But no one knows, and that's scary. You know, when the towers came down in New York, I was living in the New York area. And for a good while, we had no idea what was going to happen next. Whether there was going to be another attack and where it might happen. Now, thankfully, 21 years later, nothing that awful has occurred on our shores since. But in the days, the weeks, the months afterwards, none of us knew that, and that was scary. Some of you may even know Hollywood's history with that. Literally within walking distance of this very place, some of the 9/11 hijackers lived. They went to flight school here in Davie. Now, beyond events of world history, you have moments of personal history. And experiencing those moments cannot be easy either. What if your child faces a health challenge or a learning challenge? What if in your life you face a crisis in your finances, in your marriage, in your own health? You don't know the end of that story. You don't know what's going to happen in the future for you, for your family. And that can be scary. That is scary. So, in the words we're going to hear this morning, God answers the question of what do you do when you face scary unknowns like that? How do you move forward through them until you're in a less scary place? And in these words that we're about to hear, Jesus gives you the ultimate end of the story. And you'll be happy to know it's a happy ending. Now, before we hear those words, I want to give you a little context on the passage we're about to hear. There was a guy named John. And John was a follower of Jesus, and he was imprisoned in a remote island called Patmos, probably a prison camp. And there, God gave him a vision of the future. And God revealed to him what was going to happen, both in the near future and at the very end. That's why the book is called Revelation, the experience of Revelation. And we're going to take up that vision near the very end, at the very happy ending. And so we're going to take it up in Revelation 21. You can look in your bulletins and find the passage. Hear the word of the Lord. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. By the way, Israelites hated the water. Sea was like chaos, and that's why they did no more chaos. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals, and he will dwell with him, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." And he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, which, by the way, is the first and the last letter in the Greek alphabet, like A to Z. I'm A to Z, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. And those who conquer will inherit these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. This is the word of the Lord. And we say together, thanks be to God. Can you do that? Thanks be to God. Good job. Now, in this story, what is God trying to tell you? God is saying when life gives you unknowns, scary unknowns, God is saying, I have already given you the end of the story. And what is the end of the story? God wins. Goodness wins. Love wins. It's going to be awesome. But God is also telling you that the pattern for the ultimate end is the pattern for right now. And what does that mean? It means that when you are going through a valley, the valley is never the end of your story. The mountaintop is. And you see, when you have that sort of hope for the future, it gives you power for the present. It enables you to move through the valleys in strength because you know that valley is not the end of your story. The mountaintop is. You know when you're climbing up a mountain and it's getting hard, you know there is a top to that mountain. You know there is a future, and the future God has for you is awesome. Now, the people to whom John is writing this, they needed to know that because they are getting ready, even now beginning to enter a valley that is going to last 200 years. That means the people to whom John is writing will not live to see the end of that valley. Now, what is the valley they face? Well, almost from the beginning, persecution had occurred with Christians. The Emperor Nero, for example, had been no picnic. But it had begun to get better. And so people were hoping that maybe the heat was off. But then, John being in a prison camp, you know it was beginning to get worse. People were being ostracized. They were losing their livelihoods. The authorities were arresting them and abusing them, even killing them. And they did not know when it would end. They did not know if it would end. And so John writes to them and says, it is going to end. And it will end in victory. That the authorities who are abusing you and imprisoning you will not have the last word. The death you are facing, it will not have the last word. Jesus will win. Death will be defeated. The future is coming, and the future will be awesome. But you notice, God doesn't give them a date, right? God doesn't say 5 years from now, and it's all going to be fine. And that's important to know, because when you are going through a valley, you need to be prepared that that valley is going to last longer than you might like it to. Has anyone here ever heard of the Stockdale paradox? Anyone? All right. It gets its name from a guy named Admiral James Stockdale. And he, during the Vietnam War, was the highest ranking officer in a notoriously awful prison camp known, ironically, as the Hanoi Hilton. And while there, Stockdale developed ways for the prisoners to have dignity and strength in the face of year after year of torture and starvation. And after the war was over and he got out, our nation gave him a Medal of Honor for his efforts. He wrote a beautiful book with his wife called In Love and War about his experiences. He became a fellow at an institute at Stanford University. And some of you, maybe your grandparents particularly, might remember he became a candidate for vice president. Remember Ross Perot from Texas? That was his vice presidential candidate. Now, the business writer Jim Collins wasn't intrigued by all of that. He was intrigued by how he and his fellow prisoners, Stockdale, not only survived but triumphed in this prison in year after year of starvation and torture. And so since Collins was at Stanford University, he just went across the campus and asked Stockdale. And he said, Stockdale, how did you do it? And Stockdale said this, and I'm going to quote from Stockdale's actual words. He said, I never lost faith in the end of the story. I never doubted not only that I would get out, but that I would prevail to the end, and that experience, make that experience into the defining moment of my life, which in retrospect, I would not trade. Now, then Stockdale asked him this, well, who didn't make it out? And Stockdale said, oh, that's easy. The optimist didn't make it out. And Collins, puzzled, said, what? And Stockdale said, let me explain. See, the optimist would say, you know, Christmas is going to come and they're going to let us out. And Christmas came and went and they weren't out. And they say, don't worry, Easter's going to come and they're going to let us out. And Easter came and went and they weren't out. They said, don't worry, at Thanksgiving, they're going to let us out. And Thanksgiving came and went and they weren't out. And he said their optimism led them to utter despair. And they gave up. And then Stockdale gave his paradox. He said, you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you cannot afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your reality, whatever those facts might be. Now, if you took some time to read in this book called Revelation, before the happy ending, you'd see that God gives a lot of brutal facts about what's going to happen. But beyond that, where does the vision end? It ends where we read. It ends with victory. It ends with God wiping away every tear. It ends with the defeat of death. It ends with a new heavens and a new earth. It ends with joy. It ends with a mountain peak more amazing than anyone could ever have imagined or dreamed. But, and in that ultimate ending, God is pointing you to the pattern of how God works in the world right now, in the valleys of your life. God is saying to you, in your life, if you are facing a valley right now, that valley is not the end of your story. The mountaintop is. But, do you notice what else Stockdale said about that valley he was in? He said, yes, the vision of the end in the face of all those awful realities gave me the strength to make it through. But he said, I knew that this experience would become the defining moment of my life. And it did. Because do you know what Stockdale is remembered for today? Because beyond all his accomplishments in the military and education as a candidate, he is remembered for his paradox. The paradox he learned in the most brutal valley of his entire life. You know, we have some grandparents here today. I imagine if you've lived long enough, you have been through some valleys and seen some mountaintops. But let me ask you a question. Where did you grow the most? Was it the mountaintops or the valleys? Where did you, in the end, get wiser, stronger, better? Was it in the mountaintops or was it in the valleys? You know, Craig Groeschel, a great preacher, has said it well. He said, peaks are nice, but you don't see many farms on mountaintops. Why? Things grow better in the valleys. You know, I'm getting a little old. So I've experienced more than a few valleys in my life. I've experienced times in my life when I thought it was all going to come down around me. I've experienced nights where I was not sure if I was going to make it through the night, literally. But in those moments, two things happened. First of all, I didn't make it through because I'm here. But in those moments, I got humbled a little bit. I saw flaws in myself that I had ignored. Weaknesses God exposed in me that I needed to deal with. But what helped me get through those valleys is I knew the valley could not be the end of my story. The mountaintop had to be. And no matter what happened, God was going to find a way to get me to the mountaintop. That I might have to do some climbing along the way. I might have to pull and scrape, and my fingers might bleed. But in the end, I was going to get there. God would get me to the top of the mountain. If I kept going, and if I kept trusting, God would get me to the peak. See, because God doesn't want the valley to be the end of anyone's story. And God can and will get you to the top of the mountain if you trust God to get you there. Yet even in the valleys, God works. God works to get you ready for that mountain. What happened in those 2 centuries of persecution that John is preparing them for? The church grew. The church grew from a few thousand into the millions. Now, how did that happen? It happened because bit by bit, little by little, neighbors and friends of Christians saw people who kept loving no matter what. They kept loving in the face of abuse and persecution. They kept loving God. They kept loving each other. They kept loving their neighbors. And they never stopped loving. Even in the face of death, they stood strong. And people around them said, "Oh my God, that is amazing. I want that sort of love. I want that sort of power in my life. Maybe these Christians got something going on that maybe Venus and Minerva and some of these others gods that are out there don't." And in the end, they said, "I'm signing up for the Jesus team." And in the end, even the emperor himself signed up. And you know, that's why today we name our dogs Caesar and Brutus. And we name our children Peter and John and Mary and Jesus and Magdalena. Now, valleys didn't end with that persecution. The world has faced a lot of valleys in 2,000 years. And the church has faced a lot of valleys too. And to be honest, we haven't always behaved well in our valleys. We haven't always lived out the love we professed. But we always knew we followed a God who did live out the love that we profess. See, how can you know that the valley is not the end of your story? You know that because God knows the valleys. God went into the valleys. In Jesus, God faced the valleys of poverty. He faced valleys of oppression. He faced valleys of rejection. And yet he never stopped loving. He never stopped healing. He never stopped caring. And then he went into the deepest and darkest valley of them all. And in that valley, all his friends rejected him. His own religion turned its back on him, and the Romans killed him. And even then, Jesus never stopped loving, never stopped forgiving. And Jesus became utterly alone on that cross, so you can know you never will be alone in your valleys ever. Jesus went to death and beyond. So you can know even in the valley of the shadow of death, you are not alone. God's wrath and God's staff, they comfort you. And even in Jesus, death itself does not have a last word. Jesus' love does. So, if you are going through a valley, know this. That valley, it's not the end of your story. That mountain that you're climbing, it's not the end of your story. There is a top to that mountain. And God will get you to that peak. Now you can choose to wallow in the valley. You can choose to sit there and give up. Or you can let God guide you to the peak. You can let God give you strength to get up the mountain. You can let God walk with you in your valleys and get you to where you need to go. And you can even let God teach you in the valleys so you come out not bitter on the other side, you come out better, right? You don't want to come out bitter, you want to come out better. But in the middle of all that, you can get to the mountaintop, and then what you can do? You can willingly go back into the valley so you can show someone else the way up. So you can say, hey, this valley's not the end of your story. The mountaintop is. And I say to you as somebody who knows some valleys, the valley is never the end of your story. The mountaintop is. Amen?